Hello, I'm going to talk about the therapist in family therapy practice. First, I would like to refer to a case, and this is the case of 9-year-old Mick and his family, consisting of his mother and his sister, 12 years old, Emily. And this family lost the father 1 year ago. The father committed suicide. And the problem was that Mick had been isolating himself, having not a lot of contact anymore in the class or with his friends and so on, and trying to be close to his mother all the time. And this was something that worried the mother very much, and so she contacted me for family therapy. And we planned the first session, and I was going to meet them in the waiting room. And when I came into the waiting room, I saw them sitting there, mother and Emily, the sister, and Mick. And I went to mother, I shook her hands, and I introduced myself, and I said hello. Then I went to Emily, and I shook her hand, and I said hello. And then I wanted to go to Mick, but then something happened. When I wanted to go to Mick to shake hands and to say hello, he showed me his dinosaurs, and it was like these were plastic dinosaurs, and he showed them to me, and I said, "Hi, Mick, I'm Peter," and he answered, "Rrr." And I replied, "Whoa, they look dangerous. I better be careful." And he answered, "Rrr." And I said then, these dinosaurs, it's good that you have them with you and you can take them into the session. They will make sure that nothing bad happens to you or the family. And he said, again, and mother said, "Mick, please be polite, shake the hand of the therapist, and let's go to the consultation room." So we went to the consultation room, and the point I wanna think about is what happened there, and I want to especially focus on my own response to mixed dinosaurs, in the sense that when I went in the waiting room, I didn't have a clue that there would be dinosaurs, or that Mick would threaten me with these dinosaurs. And of course, I didn't know how to react. I hadn't thought about it. So when I said at first, "Oh, they look dangerous, I'll better be careful," I was surprised when I heard myself saying this. So I didn't rehearse it in my head. And these are some of the things I would like to talk about today. How we choose our actions in the heat of the moment of a family therapy session. So that's what we're going to talk about. My talk about the person of the therapist should in fact be seen in the context of recent psychotherapy research that shows that the part of the effectiveness of therapy can be explained by the therapist. Part can be explained by the model that we use. Part can be explained by the therapeutic relationship, but also part can be explained by a specific therapist. That's the first thing. A second thing that recent psychotherapy research shows is that some therapists are consistently more effective than other therapists. And this is important because this means that, in fact, if you have a group of 100 therapists, for instance, some of them will have consistently good outcomes, some of them will have consistently bad outcomes, and most of them will be in the middle. It's like a bell curve. And so most of the therapists will have good outcomes and bad outcomes, but some will have really good outcomes and some will have really bad outcomes. What's interesting about that is that based on this finding, a whole new domain of psychotherapy research developed. And in this domain, the question is, what are the characteristics of these therapists that are so effective. And it's interesting to look at this group of very effective therapists and to see what do they do that makes them effective. That's the second thing that comes out of recent psychotherapy research. The third thing is that it seems that this difference between being more effective or less effective can be influenced by training. So if we train therapists in the right way, they become more effective. What does it mean in the right way? Well, it means that it's not about training in certain models or in certain techniques or whatever. It's about training in their flexibility and their skills in forming good therapeutic alliances in challenging situations. That's the most important thing. And this is, especially for family therapists, this is very important because as a matter of our domain, we are always confronted with complex alliances. We have alliances with couples, we have alliances with families, we have alliances with extended families, and so on and so on. And these alliances, by definition, are in fact complex. And so our skills in forming such complex alliances are very important in order for us to be effective as therapists. Of course, in the family therapy tradition, there is a long tradition of focusing on the person of the therapist in training. And usually the metaphor of the wounded healer is used as a frame for this kind of research and training. And the basic idea is that the therapist now, the therapist functioning now with his family, has a history. And we look back, for instance, in training or in supervision, we look back at the history of the therapist, trying to understand what makes this therapist now effective, or what makes how it can help us understand why the therapist is now in an impasse, or what are maybe resources in the history of the therapist that can help this therapist to overcome this impasse, and so on. This is what we can call historical retrospective perspective on the therapist in the psychotherapy practice. A very important name in this context is Harry Aponte. Harry Aponte developed for years, and he had a lot of publications about that. For years he has developed this model of the person of the therapist. It's a training model, it's a supervision model, and he has really interesting publications about that, and also a book that is really, if you're interested in this historical perspective, then you should get to know the work of Harry Aponte. What I want to do is to focus not on the historical dimension, not looking back in history, but on the present moment. And I want to understand the psychology of the therapist in the present moment of the session. What happens in the person of the therapist while the therapist is in action? And in order to better understand the psychology of the therapist in action, I will get some inspiration from dual process models from cognitive psychology. In cognitive psychology, the last 20 years, a lot of dual process models have been developed. There are differences, small differences between these models, but in broad strokes, they are very similar too. The most famous of these models is the model of Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in 2003, and his dual process model has two cognitive systems. There's one cognitive system that is called System 1, or fast thinking, and that's the system in which the person is intuitively responsive to the surroundings in which the person functions. And so this is quite automatic behavior that you get in a certain context, and it's behavior that fits the context at that moment. Another cognitive system is what's called system 2, or slow thinking, and this is more explicit reflection, explicit reasoning on certain issues, on certain problems, and so on. And so what in that cognitive system is very strong in going step by step in analyzing a certain problem and moving towards a certain solution, and to find ways to deal with certain challenges. But you need time to go step by step, often following certain procedures and so on. So you have these two systems, this fast intuitive system and this slow reflective step-by-step system. And in the functioning of a therapist in practice, these two systems both are present. The fast system is very active at the moment when the therapist is immersed in the session. And the therapist is in fact part of this therapeutic system together with the family, and is immersed in the session and is responsive to everything that happens in the session. It's a fast system. There is not a lot of time to reflect and to weigh options and so on. No, it's a fast system. That's system 1. System 2 in practice is more like the explicit reflection on what happens in the session. I reflect on what I see happening in the session, but I also reflect on myself in the session. In fact, this system 2 in family therapy practice, it's a kind of self-supervision. I look at the session and I look at my actions and I try to reflect on, was it a good idea to do this, and was it a good idea to ask this question, and was it a good idea to address father, and so on. Also, I ask myself the question, what should I do next? If this is the situation, if that's the problem that is in the session, what should I do next? And so the system 2 is in fact a self-supervisor. So you have in fact two aspects of cognitively, two aspects. You have the fast system, which is an intuitive, responsive therapist, and you have the slow system, which is in fact a kind of self-supervisor. And these two systems, they are present at the same time in the session. They always both are present, but one may be more front stage and the other backstage, and it can turn around when it's necessary. That, for instance, that in your intuitive actions you're stuck, then it's necessary to take time to really reflect on what's happening, and then the system turns around again, and so on. And this balancing between these two cognitive systems that are present at the same time, but this balancing will result in certain actions that we take in the session with the family. A good therapist is a therapist that is good in the fast system and in the slow system, and is also flexible in moving, in oscillating from one system to the other. It's at certain moments in the session I will be close to the family. I will it will be especially my fast thinking system that will be dominant, and the other system will be more in the background. But then I will take some time to reflect on what's happening in the session. Then the slow cognitive system will be more active, and the fast thinking will be more in the background, and so on. And that way, in the session, I will oscillate between the two different cognitive systems. A question we can ask ourselves is if we think about the person of the therapist in family therapy practice, if we think using the dual process models from cognitive psychology as a frame, what about the reflection of the therapist? What about the inner conversation of the therapist? And in that sense, we can say that when the therapist is close to the family, is immersed in the session, is very close to the family, it will be especially the fast thinking cognitive system that will be active, and there will not be a lot of room for the inner conversation. There will be some inner conversation, but these inner reflections will be very simple and maybe impulsive, and there will be an abbreviation of sometimes it's just an outcry rather than an explicit explanation of what I'm feeling. I will have an outcry like, oh, I, and so on. These are in my inner conversation. So it will not be very polyphonic, it will not be very nuanced. No, it will be very short sentences or pieces of sentences or words, and that's all there is. And that's the inner conversation during the moments in which I'm close to the family, immersed in the session. If I have more distance, if I can take more distance and also have more time to reflect, then I can be more nuanced in my inner conversation. I can take different positions. I can think about a session from the perspective of the father. I can think about the session from the perspective of the mother. I can think about the session from the perspective of the son, and so on. And I can take different perspectives, and I can weigh these perspectives, and I can evaluate my own actions. I can think about, I asked this question to father, was this a good question? Should I have asked something else? Maybe I should have addressed mother, and so on. I can reflect on what I've been doing. I see my intention of what I've been doing, but maybe my intention was good, but maybe the effect was not so good. So what was my intention? What was the effect? How did the family react to my interventions, and so on? These are all kinds of questions I can ask myself in my inner conversation, and I need more space, more mental distance, in order to ask these questions in a more nuanced way, in a polyphonic way, and in the complexity of reflecting on what is happening in the session. If we decide to use the dual process models from cognitive psychology, if we decide to use these models to reflect on the person of the therapist, this also raises the question, what about training? This is an important question, and the answer to this question is probably not so obvious. I'm going to give you two ideas. The first idea is that based on these cognitive psychology dual process models, we can say that these intuitive, responsive actions of the therapist are very important. We can, for instance, refer to the case of Mick and the dinosaurs, and then we see that my intuitive response to what happened with these dinosaurs. In fact, at that moment, I didn't know what I was doing. I just did it in response to what Mick did with the dinosaurs. It's only afterwards, later in the session, that Emily told me that Mick had in fact been scared to come to the therapy because the therapy was in the same, the consultation room of for the therapy was in the same hospital as the hospital where his father died. And the story is the following. The father tried to commit suicide, but he wasn't killed instantly. He was still alive. He was in a coma. They brought him to the hospital, and they tried to make him conscious again and hope that he would survive and so on. But after a week he died. During that week, the family, the mother and the two children, had come to visit the father. And during that week also, Mick had been thinking, my father is going to recover, is going to survive. But then he died. And the implicit idea of Mick was something happened in the hospital, and that's the reason why my father died. So when he came for the therapy session, 1 year later with his family, when he came to the therapy session for therapy, he was afraid that maybe something might happen in the hospital like a year before with his father. And so when I said, it's good that you brought your dinosaurs because they will protect you and your family so that nothing bad will happen to you, this was really a very good response. I didn't know that. I didn't know it was a good response. I couldn't have known it beforehand. But still, by being intuitively responsive, I must have connected with something untold in what Mick brought in the session in the waiting room with his dinosaur. I must have sensed something. I don't know. I cannot explain. But anyway, the important thing is that afterwards I know that it was spot on what was important at that moment for Mick. So, in fact, what we have to teach our trainees is that they have to trust and trust their intuitive responsiveness, but at the same time be critical. Because our intuition can also lead us astray, lead us in the wrong direction. And so we have to follow our intuition, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, and then be critical and look at our intuition and see if it brought us where we wanted to go. Did it bring us somewhere useful for the family? That's the main idea. And evaluating your intuitive interventions, you can do by listening to the feedback that you get from the family spontaneously in the session, but also you can, and I would really recommend that, you can work in a feedback-oriented way, in such a way that specifically after each session you specifically take time to ask for feedback about the process, not outcome feedback. You can do it too, but that's not what I mean. I mean feedback about the process. Did they feel understood? How did they experience the session, and so on, in order to get some sense of was it a good intervention, and was it not a good intervention? A second point in terms of training I want to make is that it's important that we help our trainees to reflect. We cannot expect from ourselves that we can do therapy automatically, and that we can do it without moments of reflection. And so we can teach our trainees how to make moments of reflection in practice. And we can do it in the session. We can do it while we're talking with the family. We can reflect on the session. But then we will not have so much space. We can do it explicitly, for instance, by saying to the family, oh, wait a moment, I need some time to think about that. And just take a few seconds to really think about what's happening in the session. We can also do it more explicitly. We can say to the family, wait a moment, let's take a break of 10 minutes, and this will help me to reflect a little bit on what's going on. And after 10 minutes I come back, and then we go on with the session. Or I can also learn to go, after a difficult session, to go to a supervisor. And a supervisor can help me to reflect on the session. So it's important for our trainees to know that it's important to have these moments of reflection, and that they also feel comfortable with making such moments of reflection. It's also important to know, for trainees to know, what should I reflect on? And then, for instance, I think it's important that as a therapist I reflect on the family. What's going on in the family? What's happening there? I should reflect on the therapy. Why do we want therapy? What good could therapy do for them? What would be a goal for therapy? It could be on specific interventions. I could say, well, I did this and I intended to do that, and I can reflect on the effect. I did this intervention, but what was the effect of that? How did they respond to that intervention? I can also reflect on my positioning. Am I flexible enough in positioning in a good way to all of the family members, or am I too close, too wrapped up with the view of the perspective of one person and not close enough to the others? What I really need is the flexibility to be close to everybody and back off, close to the other and back off, close to the other and back off, and flexible in positioning, in moving between the different family members. And of course, reflection also has to do with what will I do next? What should I do next? What should be my next step, and so on. And so all these questions are important, and we have to teach our trainees that it's important to reflect on all these things in order for them to be more effective. I hope that these reflections I give you and these ideas I give you, that you can use them in your practices, and that it will help you to become a more effective family therapist for the families that need your help. Thank you.